Good evening. You're not very friendly. It's ridiculous. I noticed that some of you guys have strange accents. So when you're asking questions then, speak slowly so that I can understand you. I'll try to do the same. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to get the opportunity just to talk to you and to share some thoughts with you. My remit was not to give you a lecture, so I won't be giving you a lecture. And I do want to get you to think. And one of the best ways to help people to think differently is by telling a story. So a lot of what I want to do this evening is to get you to think differently and to tell you some stories that will help that process. Now, I'm a theologian, which has its pluses and minuses in life. People automatically yawn as soon as you say that word. It's important because my perspective tonight is I want you to be thinking about theology. I want you to think about not just a kind of dislocated theology. I want you to understand precisely. Thank you very much. I didn't get applause afterwards. I'm happy. Actually, maybe this is the best time to do it. I want to think theologically about disability, because the way in which you understand God and human beings determines the way in which you respond to God and human beings. And so theory and practice are inextricably interlinked in that sense. So when I want to talk to you about theology, I really want to talk to you about the way in which we practice and the underlying assumptions that sit behind that. But before I get into the meat of where I'm going to take you, I'll tell you a little bit about my favourite subject, which is myself, because I am incredibly humble, you're right. Because my background is necessary for what I say to you to make sense. My background is in nursing. I spent many years working within the area of mental health. Initially as a nurse, and then laterally as a mental health care chaplain. Now, my task as a chaplain was very interesting because I was working with people who were coming out of long-term psychiatric care and into the community. And my task as a community mental health chaplain was to try and help people to find a spiritual space within a community which would enable them, as part of their recovery, to become integrated into society. And the thing you notice straight away is that religious communities are deeply excluded, in particular people who are perceived to be different. So while you might expect people who are perceived to be different to be accepted within that community where there's no rich or poor, barbarian, Greek, male or female or anything else, in reality that's not the case. And I've always been curious as to why that wasn't the case. What was it that was the problem, particularly with psychosis and particularly with severe mental health problems? What was the problem with religious communities? And I also trained in the area of intellectual disability, what used to be called mental handicap, which you guys I think call developmental disability, and which we in the UK call learning disability, which you in the US call dyslexia. It's really quite straightforward. And so I spent a good deal of time, many years in fact, working with people with severe intellectual disabilities. And again, I see the same thing. Why is it that people with intellectual disabilities, for example, are excluded from taking the sacraments in some churches? Why is it that people with intellectual disability find it so difficult to find friendship, find acceptance, and so on and so forth? And so, all my life, all my professional life, I've spent with people who, because they are disabled or labelled disabled, struggle to find any kind of place within the community, in society, or within the church. I'm fascinated as to why that is. What is it about disability, or particularly these forms of disability, that people find so threatening? And it's something to do with the way in which we perceive theology, i.e. the way we understand God and human beings, but it's something to do with the way in which we understand the essence of what it means to be a human being. Stephen Post, who's a very interesting ethicist, who does fascinating work on dementia, talks about the problem of a hypercognitive society. Now, by hypercognitive, it's a big word for a simple concept. This means that we place too much emphasis on reason and intellect. We assume that reason and intellect are sitting right at the heart of what it means to be human, which is why things like Alzheimer's disease, which is why things like intellectual disability, schizophrenia, all these things are so threatening, because they seem to push at that which society has decided is the essence of what it means to be human. And so you don't just have these conditions actually say something profoundly important about who you're perceived to be. And when I began to think back in my experience with these two groups of people, it was pretty clear to me that was the problem. Hypercognition, placing too much emphasis on what it means to be human as based in reason and rationality. And then once I kind of stumbled into academia, as I did in the early 90s, I began to think about all of that in a theological context. And exactly the same things there. I began to read people like Augustine, who told me that the image of God is reason, intellect. Look at Aquinas, I find the same thing. And throughout the tradition, I find that the essence of what it means to be human seems to be located in this strange place called the mind, called the intellect. And that was a theological challenge to me, because I had to work out, A, what it means to be human, and B, what it means to begin to ask different questions of the tradition, starting from the experience of people with disabilities, and in particular, people with a form of disability who seems to be so culturally challenging. And so it seems to me that the way in which we begin to think about meeting the spiritual needs of people with developmental disabilities in their families is not simply by looking at how we can change structures, how we can have more simple liturgies or anything like that. We need to begin at a deeper level by thinking about what it means to rethink disability. And even beyond that, what does it mean to do theology with people who have developmental disabilities? What does it mean to draw that experience into our theological understanding, and from there begin to explore what the possibilities are for any changes in our practices? And so that's the kind of context for where I want us to be thinking about this evening. What does it mean to do theology with people with developmental disabilities? The theologian Karl Barth talks about the idea of the Bible, and he describes the Bible as a strange new world. He talks about a strange new world within the Bible. And his point is that rather than trying to translate culture, a Bible, into the language that culture understands and it's acceptable to everybody, the way in which we should understand the Bible is that it's a strange new world. It's a place where we discover things that we couldn't find in culture. It's a place where we discover ideas, concepts, narratives, perspectives that are simply not available. And the point of the church, he wants to suggest, is not to make itself rational and reasonable to the world, but to look at what the world looks like in the light of the Bible. When you take our current practices, the way that we see the world, place it in the strange new world of the Bible, what does all of that stuff look like? And that's kind of what I want to try and do with us all this evening, is to begin to see what does disability look like when we explore it from the strange new world within the Bible. And the place I want to begin is a passage that you're probably very familiar with, but one that I think sets the context quite nicely. Psalm 139 says this of power of it. It's for you inform my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will give thanks for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. My soul knows that very well. My frame wasn't hidden from you when I was made in secret, woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my body. In your book they were all written, the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there were none of them. I think it's a really, really interesting passage. Because when most of us read that, when I read that, I think to myself, isn't it fantastic that God should weave me and turn me into the person that I am? And then I think a little bit deeper and think, but presumably that applies to everybody. That God is involved and engaged in weaving and bringing together the bodies and the minds of all human beings, including those whom we have chosen to call disabled. And that becomes really tricky, because what's really being said there is that somehow, in the midst of the profoundest developmental disability, God's there, working there. Not just working there, God somehow, in some mysterious way, has brought that experience in that person's life to fruition. Now, but that don't mean that idealistically, that it's a fantastic thing that God's created disability, so therefore we all must celebrate that. I simply mean that disability has much more theological significance than simply the process of trying to get rid of it. But there's something that, embedded in that psalm that says, each life, no matter what you look like, no matter what shape you are, no matter what form you are, no matter what your cognitive possibilities are, God has placed a meaning in the midst of disability. And that meaning isn't simply focused on getting rid of that disability. That meaning may well be located in the heart of that experience of disability. And I think that's quite challenging, because I don't know I don't know about you. How do you, when you think about God, what do you see? But when I think about God, the person I see as God is suspiciously like myself. I'm powerful, but God more powerful. I'm extraordinarily handsome. I don't know why you're laughing. God's beautiful. And actually, oftentimes, our image of God and who God is and how God functions is obviously just like ourselves, blown up bigger. But this psalm suggests something differently. It suggests that to be human is to be in the image of God. But to be in the image of God may well be very, very different in the way we normally assume the image of God to look like. So what might disability look like in this strange new world of the Bible? Well, the first thing to bring to attention, which you've probably noticed before, but God uses people with disabilities at key points in history. We take something like, take for example Moses. Moses is a really significant speech impediment. He couldn't talk. And yet God gives the responsibility for the commandments of God to somebody who can't talk. Let me read this passage to you. Exodus 4:10-11. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant, and slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I'll help you speak, and will teach you what to say." And again, you get this thing: who makes these people deaf? Who makes these people mute? Gives these people mouths? God simply saying that something that kind of disability is part of creation. He's not saying, well, it's a consequence of the fall. He's not saying it's because anybody's done anything wrong. He's simply saying, well, who does these things? And yet, at the same time, despite his profound speech defect, he gives Moses this fantastic role to carry the word. And you see the same thing in Paul. The Apostle Paul has this mysterious thing called thorn in his flesh. And he prays 3 times and it doesn't go away. And so he's left with that, and his response is, "Well, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So rather than saying, well, isn't it a terrible thing that I've got a thorn in my flesh, he says, actually this thorn in my flesh may be the place where I encounter and can communicate you in fresh and radical ways. So Paul, the greatest missionary of all time, is a disabled person. And God gives them this mission, without which none of us would be sitting here, because the gospel wouldn't have, this beautiful university may have been in the realm of some pagan religion or whatever it is. Maybe it already is, I don't know what we hear it. I'll check that out. And so there's nothing inherent within a disability that prevents a person from serving God in deep and profound ways. So in that strange new world of the Bible, disability has a different meaning, a very different meaning from the meaning that we've placed upon it in culture. And we need to be really, really careful with that. Because culturally we tend to think that disability is always disadvantageous, always something that's simply there so that we can overcome it. It seems to me in the strange new world that the Bible has a different meaning, a different history, and a different purpose. One of the things that's always fascinated me is the question of what it means to worship God without words. We were fortunate that at Aberdeen University we have what's called the Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability. The Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability is a gathering place for a series of research projects that looks at various aspects of disability. So there's two strands, one that looks at the theology of disability, and one that looks at the relationship between spirituality and health. And over the past few years, we've been doing quite a lot of work on the theology of disability, focused around people with developmental disabilities. And for the most part, it's been people with quite mild forms of developmental disability. Actually, people have got words, because the kind of methods we have used to talk to people about their spiritual experiences, it requires words, and we kind of record these words and then make judgments on that basis. The big space in the literature is for people with severe developmental disorders, and trying to work out what and how we understand the spiritual lives of people with severe intellectual stroke developmental disabilities. And so for the past 2 years we've begun to explore that whole question. What does it mean to be a spiritual person without any words? Or perhaps even more complicated, this is a conversation Michael and I had the other night. What does it mean to know Jesus when you don't have any words? So I'm fascinated by this idea of wordlessness. And so what we've been doing is collecting stories of people and beginning to work out what it means to have a spirituality without words. Let me give you an example of the way that things have been done. What I want you to think about is this. What does it mean to learn and to do theology with people with a developmental disability? And I want us to hold that question and think about what that might look like. And they might ask the question, what does theology look like? So we spent some time with Katie. Now, Katie is a very interesting person. She has a profound developmental disability. She has no words, and as far as we know, she has some degree of ability to understand certain basic concepts, but really no ability to at least reciprocate as far as we can tell. But the interesting thing about Katie is that she's learned to pray. And indeed, she, I don't know if you guys have over here, do you have a sign system called Makaton? In the UK, we have a sign system called Makaton, which is for people with developmental disabilities, which is a series of signs like smile, love, Jesus, and so on and so forth. Well, Katie has learned and is learning to pray. And every time she says, the Makaton sign for thank you is something like thank you. But she's decided that it's not thank you, that actually thank you is the sign for prayer, which is quite interesting and quite poignant. But we spent a lot of time with her and her family. And we, her mother gave us this story. Let me just read this to you. You can maybe give me a solution to it. Note from her diary. Mum remarked in her diary, on an incident that took place at the Girls' Brigade. The Girls' Brigade is a kind of church organisation for people with, for young Christians, and Katie goes along to this regularly. One of the leaders had broken her foot badly. The children were asked who would like to lead the prayers for the woman's foot. Katie volunteered. The next day, the leader was told at the hospital that her foot had healed well enough for her to be able to stop using crutches. The leader believes that it was Katie's prayer that made the difference to her foot. Isn't that interesting? We've got a little jot here. The mechanics of how Katie might pray are interesting because private reflective prayer often utilises an individual's internal monologue, but Katie has no words. What does it mean? What might it mean to pray without words? What would that say to us about who God is and how God functions if someone who has no words can pray and God can respond in that way? Now, there's lots of ways in which you could rationalise it. There's lots of ways in which you could avoid the issue. But what if that was the case? What would our theology of prayer look like if we were no longer simply dependent on words for prayers? It's dissonant, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's something profoundly important. I'll come back to wordlessness towards the end of what I want to say. But I want to move on a little bit now, and I want to think about, in the university, which many, maybe all of you, have experience of, we like to use big words. Soteriology, eschatology, pneumatology, and nobody has a clue what those things mean. Even theologians don't know what they mean. They're just able to bluff their way around, because nobody knows the ways of the Holy Spirit. I spent some time, there's a purpose for it, at the beginning of this project I'm talking to you, I spent some time at a L'Arche community in Trolley in France. I don't know if you're familiar with the L'Arche communities, but I'll give you a potted history that makes a little bit of sense to you. L'Arche communities were founded in 1964 by Jean Vanier. Now Jean Vanier and Father Philippe Thomas, who was his kind of spiritual mentor, had spent some time in the asylums of Paris visiting people. And they had been absolutely shocked by what they had seen there, by the way in which people were treated and the way in which people were degraded by their treatment. And so their response was not to develop a new social or political model of intervention and outreach. The response was very simple. What they did was they took 3 severely developmentally disabled men into their home in Trolley in France, into Jean Vanier's home. On the first night, the first one of the men had to be sent home because the behaviour was uncontrollable for that. But for many years, Jean Vanier lived together with these 2 men. But the key thing about the way they lived together was this: they didn't live together as carer and cared for, they lived together as friends. So Jean Vanier, steeped in Catholic spirituality, and particularly steeped in the idea of the friendship of Jesus, formed this small community, which then has now burgeoned into 155 communities throughout the world. The key thing being that the relationships within L'Arche are not the same as in service provision in that sense. They're designed on a different basis. You welcome people in and you offer them friendship and mutuality, and the relationship is not as carer and cared for, but as friends. And the interesting thing about the L'Arche communities is they're very much narrative culture. If you ask anybody a question in a L'Arche community, they'll tell you a story. And this story I think is interesting. And it's Jean-Pierre, who was a man with a severe developmental disability, who also had a heart condition. And he had just been down to Paris to see the cardiologist. And he had come back, and his friend in the place where he lived asked him where he'd been. And he said, "I've been to Paris to see the doctor." I said, oh, what did the doctor do? He said, the doctor looked into my heart. Oh, that's interesting. And so, well, what did he see there? And he said, he saw Jesus. And he said, oh, and what was he doing? He said, he was resting. Now, it seems to me that in terms of pneumatology, that's probably the best description of being at one with the Holy Spirit that I've ever come across. If Jesus looked into my heart, he certainly looked at the rest. It makes us more a little bit cross. But there's something profoundly important about it. You know, Paul talks about the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. We use that language all the time. But what does that actually mean? It seems to me, if you listen to Jean-Pierre, who clearly has exactly the same theology, but is able to articulate it much more clearly and much more effectively, perhaps, than most of us. Jesus is my heart, and Jesus is rest. The question is whether we are prepared to listen to that voice. So pneumatology looks differently when we listen to it from the perspective of disability. Prayer looks different when we look at it from the perspective of people with disabilities. Disability looks different when we look at it from the perspective of people with disabilities. I teach a course, taught a course, I don't anymore, in Aberdeen, which is a pastoral care course. And it's a distance learning course, which means that people are sitting in a room just like this. But there's also telephones with some people on it, and sometimes there's screens with people on it. So you get people from all over the place, and voices from all over. You can imagine trying to coordinate that. Voices on the phone, people in the room. It's fascinating. And then the last time I taught that course, we also had somebody who was completely blind and had their dog with them, and somebody who was profoundly deaf and had the dog with them. And so trying to coordinate all that stuff was fascinating. But at one stage in the course, we began to tell stories of spiritual experiences. Everybody, just for whatever reason, went around the room and told these stories. And when it came to the lady with the dog, the deaf lady, it was a hearing dog, which means that if the phone rang or if the doorbell went, the dog told her, well, the dog didn't tell her. The dog raised the issue. And she was telling this story about a spiritual experience that she'd had. And she said, it was like a dream, she said, and I went to heaven, and I met Jesus, and it was great. He was exactly the way that I assumed he would be. He was beautiful, he was kind, and his signing was amazing. That was his signing was amazing. For her concept of heaven was not that she'd be healed of her disability or it be taken away, but simply that those around her were able to communicate precisely the way she'd always communicated. From her perspective, to learn to speak would be a very alien thing to do. There's something really important about that, because all of us have visions and perspectives on what heaven might look like, what healing might look like, what the future life might be like. But her experience would suggest that whatever we imagine is probably radically different from the way that thing will actually be. That being so, what basis would we have for assuming that the only way that we can relate effectively to somebody with a developmental disability, somebody with a particular form of disability, only on the basis that we hope that they'll be healed and look something that has later on? Because for her, healing was that you, all of us, became like her, rather than that she became like us. And so heaven, when it's perceived from this perspective of disability, may look radically different, may look radically dissonant from the way in which we assume it to be. And so one final story, and before I have a conversation with you, open up for some conversation. One of the ladies, well, she's not quite a lady, I don't know, but she's 20. It's funny, you find that the older you get, the younger 20 is. It's funny, and the younger 40 is, and the younger 50 is. Seriously, it's time doesn't exist. Her name was Helen, and she had severe cerebral palsy and a very profound intellectual disability, and she was also blind. And so she spent most of her day lying on her back, and she wasn't able to speak, but she could kind of articulate certain things, and she could certainly tell you if she was anxious or if she was concerned or if things were good or if things were bad. And Helen's a Quaker, so we spent quite a bit of time within the Quaker community, just trying to work out what Quaker spirituality meant in terms of disability and her perspective of disability, and looking at how she located herself within that community. Because the interesting thing about the Quakers is that all children, irrespective of their physical or psychological disabilities, are automatically, they have a surname, but they're automatically baptized or equivalent into the community very early on. So she had been brought up as part of that community. She didn't have to be brought into it, she was simply part of that community. And there's two stories that I want to give you in relation to Helen, which come together and which I think will probably help us just to finish off what I'm saying to you. Story number one. Along with all the other difficulties that Helen had, she was recently, 2 years ago, diagnosed with leukemia. And she was taken into hospital, and she was going through a treatment, or beginning a treatment. And when she was first diagnosed, her mum came into the room, or when she was first admitted to the hospital, her mum came into the room and she said to her, "Helen, you've got leukemia." And immediately Helen became anxious and started to cry. Now, I may be wrong, I don't know, but she, Helen, has no way of conceptualizing what the word leukemia means. Okay? I may be wrong, I don't know what I should. Because one of the mistakes we oftentimes make with individual people with developmental disabilities is anticipating or assuming things that we don't know. But I think it's probably safe to know this word leukemia would be out of her range. But she cried. Second story. One of the central aspects of Quaker worship is silence. Yeah. It's the exact opposite of Presbyterianism, which is I'm a charismatic Presbyterian, so we don't do silence. Or if we do, it's an accident. Or somebody switched off the guitar after this week. So the central act of worship is silence. And when we began to talk with the community, they told us that, in the context of worship, something really strange happened with Helen. Because they said, well, sometimes she's really agitated, but as soon as we go into silence, everything changes. And then it's like, well, let's show you. And so so the community gathered together around Helen and began to, if you like, descend into their silence. And Helen was there, and she was really quite agitated and very verbal, very vocal in that way. But as soon as the silence began to emerge from the Quaker's experience, you could just see her. She began to settle down. She began to enter into a space of calmness, peacefulness. And eventually, she was at one with that community, in their silence, in their peacefulness. Now, what's going on within these two stories? The first story, as I say, I'm fairly certain that Helen didn't know what leukemia meant. Something happened. Her mother knew what leukemia meant. Her mother understood it. Her mother felt it. Her mother was anxious. Her mother was fearful. And that anxiety and fearfulness communicated. And so even though she didn't know the word, she was given the experience by her mother. Likewise, in the context of worship, the Quaker worship, as the community went into silence, as they encountered their peacefulness, so Helen was drawn into that silence and peacefulness through their silence and through their peacefulness. And again, there's something really important there. We tend to think that spirituality is an individual thing. We tend to think it's you and me, Jesus. We tend to think it's something we need to know and cognate in that sense. But it seems to me that Helen's experience suggests that spirituality is always a communal thing. That we become who we are in and through the experiences of those around us, that we experience what we experience, not simply within our own bodies, but actually within in and through the bodies of others. In the African theological tradition, there's an idea called Ubuntu. Desmond Tutu has written a lot about it, and so have other people. Within Ubuntu theology, the basic way in which people or human beings are understood is not like in our culture, I think, therefore I am, i.e. I'm an individual, so therefore I cognate and I work out who I am myself. Within Ubuntu theology, the primary way of understanding human beings is I am because we are. In other words, it's impossible for me to be me without you helping me to be me. And actually, in practice, that's exactly the way it is. The idea that we are individuals is kind of a cultural myth. We're always dependent. Even the language we use, we're dependent on others to teach us that language, to give us the concept, to give us the ideas. So we're never individuals. We're never on our own. And our spirituality really doesn't simply belong to us. It belongs to our community. And although when you think about it, it's quite obvious, it's actually when you begin to reflect on Helen's experience that it becomes really important. Because her experience is our experience. The difference is that oftentimes we don't notice it. I was, just as a kind of sidebar, I was listening to an interview by a Gaelic professor, Gaelic being the kind of traditional Scottish language, which nobody can speak, apart from his professor. Luckily, up in the north, a lot of people speak it. And he was saying, I thought this was really, really interesting. He was saying that because of the way that Gaelic is structured, because of the language and the concepts and the ideas that are encapsulated in that language, the gospel means something quite different. A lot of things mean the same, but there are nuances and ideas and ways of understanding God, self, and others that's embedded in that language that if you try to translate it, you'll never find anywhere else. I think that's really interesting, that there's something about the way in which you either articulate the gospel or experience the gospel as in Helen's situation that's unique, that actually is not transformable in that sense. Now, my point being that when Paul talks about the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, when Paul talks about the idea of the body of Christ, that we are deeply interdependent, these are not metaphors. These are actually realities, ways of being that we oftentimes forget. If we're prepared to listen carefully to the voices of people with disabilities, even if these voices are silent voices, then everything changes. Metaphors become reality. The possibility of spirituality becomes a communal possibility. And the idea of disability begins to dissolve as we see that kind of difference is nothing more than that kind of difference. And rather than being a negative thing, it actually can be a place of revelation if we're prepared to open our eyes and begin to see and hear and feel and experience the transformation that our ministry of noticing makes. It's not what we are that counts, it's whose we are that counts. And whose we are is something that we're always working towards understanding more and more fully. So, just to finish, spiritual care with people who have developmental disabilities actually turns out to be a deeply spiritual task, and actually turns out to be care for the community, or care of the community, rather than simply care of a particular individual that we mark out and define as disabled. To care well for people with developmental disabilities is to listen well, and to listen well is to open yourself up to the possibility that many things that we assume to be normal in terms of our spiritual lives are actually strangely abnormal. So I'd like you just to think about these stories, and think about what's going on with that story, because one of the things, and this is the last thing I'll say, that we oftentimes don't notice is that stories are knowledge. Now we're very used to a kind of empirical view of what knowledge might be. Empiricism basically has to do with the idea that the only things that are true are those which fall upon the retina of the eye. The only things that are true are those things that you can see or feel or prove or touch. But of course, empiricism is a highly flawed way of looking at the world. There's no empirical evidence for empiricism. It's a philosophical position. You've got to believe in philosophy before you can believe in the outcome. What stories do is remind us that there are other ways of looking at the world. Remind us that there are other ways of understanding human beings, humanness, and the essence of who God is in the midst of that. And what stories of disability do is they give us new facts. They give us new truths. They give us new ways of looking at things and give us new questions. So the essence of spiritual care begins when we learn how to listen to these stories and learn the types of practices that emerge from listening carefully to these diversity of voices. So that's all I want to say. But thank you for listening. Thank you very much. What we should do before we have a conversation, which we will do, I'm sure, take a couple of minutes and turn to the person beside you and just talk about maybe 2 or 3 points that you think are significant, and then we'll come together and we can have a conversation. All right. Now, see if what happens now, if I ask a question and nobody speaks, there'll be so much trouble. What would you like to talk about? What questions have you got? Who would like to get?
I have a question. This is a simple question. When you were talking about Katie,
Yes.
the lady who didn't have any words,
Yes.
and she, for thank you, she used this sign for prayer. You said that she volunteered to pray. How did she do that? How did she make known that she wanted to pray, and how did she pray?
Well, the mechanics are quite simple. That she was part of a group of girls for whom who all knew this person that had damaged their leg. And so they gathered together for prayer, and she participated. Now, your question was partly, how do you know she participated? And the answer is, I don't. But I don't know she didn't either. So my point would be, the thing would be important is that there's a tendency, in all people with disabilities, there's a tendency not to give people the benefit of the doubt. And so in that situation, I think the key pastoral principle would give people the benefit of the doubt and see what that looks like. But yes, there's several stories you could tell about that one scenario. I chose to tell the one which her mother perceived, which seemed to fit in with the way that she participates in these kind of activities. But it's a good question, because I think we do have to wrestle, because there is always that temptation to say, oh, I can never do that. But it's always, it's a wrestling against mystery. The thing we say before, we get a mystery puzzles, whereas if there's something avoided, I think it's a mystery. It's a good question.
Could you speak a little bit about the sovereignty of God and disabilities? And maybe even some scripture in there. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, controlling, but also disabilities. Is he passive or directive in his approach? Possibly could be both. And just all that.
So thank you for asking.
Yes.
Well, at the heart of the question you're asking is where is God in the midst of suffering? I'm not necessarily equating disability with suffering, but there's something mysterious about where God is when certain things happen. So you've got a tension between the providence of God, which within which Psalm 139, for example, would mean that absolutely everything occurs because God marks it out. Or you've got the idea of free will in the midst of that, where human beings have some degree of control over where they are. So it's a very deep and complicated theological problem at that level. But the underlying question about why, I think, is for me, the interesting one. I wrote a book in 2006 called Raging with Compassion, which was about Theodicy. It was about the problem of evil, and began to explore, why is it that God allows, why is it that God has all strength, all power, all might, allows suffering, and all love allows suffering. And the basic conclusion for that book, I maybe shouldn't tell you because I won't be able to buy it. The basic conclusion of that book is this: that Scripture really doesn't tell you why they're suffering. It just doesn't. On the cross, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there's no huge word that comes out of the cloud and says, well, this is why. And sometimes, by trying to make explanations, we make things worse. So you take something like disability and you say, well, clearly the reason for developmental disability is because of sin, because we live in a fallen world. But we all live in a fallen world. There's no particular reason why a person with developmental disability is any more or any less fallen than anybody else in the world. So why would we ask that question? Why would we use that explanatory framework on that individual and not on another individual? So I think what Scripture does is it doesn't give you explanations for evil, suffering, difference, and so on and so forth, but it gives you a set of practices that you can engage with, which will enable you to remain faithful in the midst of evil, in the midst of suffering. And I think that's key. It's not necessarily to ask questions which can't be answered, because it's really a product of modernity that we find ourselves very, very difficult to live with and unanswered questions, because the idea of progress, the idea eventually we'll find an answer and a solution to everything, including the problem of evil. It's just the way that we've been enculturated into thinking. Eventually we'll find an answer. Oh, maybe there are no answers. It seems to be what Scripture, well, maybe there is an answer, because if you look at the beginning of the book of Job, clearly the reason why there's suffering in the world is because of God's gambling habits. So by trying to explain by trying to explain it, you actually end up making things worse. And so it's maybe just developing the types of practices that will enable us to live well in the face of unanswered questions that is the answer to that question. The providential question is very similar. Does God create all suffering in the world? I don't know. But I do know that on the cross something happened that addresses that and enables me to understand it in a way that without that knowledge I wouldn't be able to understand it. And those practices that I engage in and learn as a Christian enable me to stand strong in the face of evil and suffering in a way that's constructive and loving. So I may not know the answer to the question, but I do know the response to the question. So although it may be a philosophical problem, it's not necessarily a practical problem. And one way of thinking about that, the types of practices, is through the Psalms of lament. I don't know about the church and you guys are involved in it, but when did you last hear a sermon on lament? On sadness and brokenness, anger and outrage. And it seems to me that one way of beginning to think about dealing with our own anger and outrage at the way certain things happen in the world is by reclaiming the practice of lament. Because lament's really interesting. If you look at the structure of the Psalms of Lament, they run in an interesting way. You get this initial huge outburst of anger and outrage. And sometimes, for example, in the imprecatory psalm, you get ridiculous things saying like, Lord, take the Babylonian babies and mash their heads on the rocks. You get really outrageous anger. But then, almost always, not in every case, the psalmist comes back, and he comes back to the central part of the psalm, which is he remembers God's hesed, God's unchanging love. So he's really angry, but he comes back and says, but still I trust you, and yet I hold on to your unfailing love. And then the psalm resolves on a hopeful note in that sense. Psalm 88 doesn't. The certain psalms just stop dead. Darkness is my only companion. But then sometimes how you feel. So it seems to be reclaiming the practices of lament is one way of beginning to cope with that. And I guess in the context of living with profound intellectual disability or any other form of disability, there is a real tension between the kind of hopeful, transformative ways of interpreting Scripture that have been offered to you and the real need for lament in the midst of the difficulties and pain that people experience. There's a lot of using the fullness of Scripture rather than that which we prefer. That was a long, rambling answer to a very good question.
I have a more practical question. Do you have some suggestions? I'm a pastor in charge of spiritual formation at our church. We have several people that are challenged in different ways. What are just some practical things that I should keep in mind to help engage all of our congregants in growing spiritually?
What would be the main areas that would be a difficulty?
I think helping the community feel comfortable. So we have somebody who comes and is very expressive and very friendly, but maybe overly touchy, and it comes on its own. And so how do I help him know what are the appropriate boundaries and help others not be so uncomfortable that they won't sit and welcoming them to conversation, or how do I engage them in a group? We have others that, I think a lot of it is social. It's how do we delicately address so that both are engaged in what?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, because people need to have boundaries. In any community, requires strong boundaries for it to be a community. And I guess the way in which you might want to think about that is just in terms of advocacy. I know in my own ministry and chaplaincy, take the example of people with severe intellectual mental health problems. The way in which we work to integrate them into community is simply by befriending. Now, what I mean by that is that I, as a chaplain, had a responsibility to develop, if you like, a professional friendship. And there's a tension in that expression, because professional is supposed to keep distance, friendships close. And I think for ministry, that's the tension that you're working with. But my task was to accompany and to befriend individuals and to take them into religious communities and to work with that community around these very issues, and to enable people within that community to take my role as advocate and facilitator in that sense. And the temptation, of course, for all communities was, oh, I'm glad you're here. And off they go, here's the thing. But identifying disability champions within your congregation would be the key. People who have both an interest and a skill, these two things are not always the same thing, who would be able to get alongside that individual and work with these kind of problematic issues. So that's the thing. Without patronising and saying, well, let's create a special needs ministry. Because the problem with special needs ministries, and they be fine, is that they tend to become isolated from the rest of the community. So you have a special needs community over here with experts, that's really not where you want to go. So disability champion, I think, would be the first place to go, enabling the community to get close and overcome their fear, because fear is the key thing. People are afraid of it. Secondly, to preach well on the issue. Because the place that people get most of their information on disability is just from cultural stereotypes, from the media, and from the worst thing that could ever happen, which always are the things that are reported. But if you, for example, had a sermon series focusing in on really what Scripture says about disability, how that might be understood, what the practicalities of that are, alongside of identifying people as disability champions, then at least that's a beginning place for identifying the issues and overcoming the fear and the stigma. And this fear and stigma is important.
I'd like to respond in a couple ways to the conversation this evening. I'm Dave Emery, the Executive Director for the Bridge Disability Ministries here in the Seattle area. Bridge has been around 25 years, working with folks with disabilities of all kinds. The ways we've done it, the ways we continue to do it, is to have special services throughout the Lee County area. Churches, we were at Crossroads Bible Church in Victoria last night, or rather Sunday night, with 100 folks gathered together for a celebration. It's not suffering, it's joy. The fact is that they get together and they have a great time seeing each other. The church comes out, the people are changed by that experience. I can just share with you incident after incident how those churches and the individuals are different after that happens. This Sunday we're going to be at Holy Spirit Lutheran Church in Kirkland, where actually they're inviting us to a Sunday morning worship, which is a marvelous experience. And we will be sharing communion together. That has happened for the first time last year. It's happening again this year. And they're asking a Presbyterian to come preside it, communion, to help share that with folks that are not able to verbalize. And we're very sensitive to folks who are invited to the table, but we do not presume that they want to be at the table unless they give expression that is something that they desire. So it's a tricky process. But I'm really pleased that there's a church that is eager and open to participating in that process. One of our greatest challenges is that These 15 churches we had these events in last year, probably more than that this year. That's their one occasion a year. And they've done it, and it helps them, and they really enjoy it, and it's wonderful. But it's not an ongoing relationship. So we're building a way of companionship, a way of sharing with those folks how they can actually incorporate and invite folks. And many churches are. Many churches have a few folks with disabilities of many kinds. But 1 in 5 in this country, as we know, have a disability. And there are certainly rare churches where 1 in 5 are present in the population. 1 in 50 is comfortable. 1 in 5 is challenging. And that is our hope. I think the time has come. Our society has made it clear that we need to prioritize and value these folks. I came to Seattle expecting to begin a contemplative ministry of helping with spiritual formation and the contemplative process. And I was in silence praying for 4 months, not totally in silence. I was also moving in, doing some other things, but 4 months, and just never went about organizing or pursuing that process. And then one of the chaplains at Bridge came and invited me to this ministry. And the first time I experienced it, I realized that what I want to talk about is realized and experienced by this process. There is something about being in the presence of a person, especially nonverbal, but even those that are verbal but are suffering a variety of ways through disabilities. They are fully spiritual. They are not disabled in any regards in the spiritual environment. And in fact, they may help us, who tend to be such more superficial and expecting everybody to look a certain way, act a certain way, behave a certain way. This experience cuts through a lot of that superficiality to a very deep place, some place that is extremely powerful for us. And I have found that to be true. And I can share with you story after story about that experience with folks. Go to churches where they resist, they expect to cook dinner for us. And sometimes they do it on occasions where they may not totally be prepared for folks coming an hour and a half late to dinner. And they have to have food for it. And they want to clean up and go home. And the fact is that as soon as they experience and see the folks, it's changed. It's no longer a task. It's no longer a duty. It's no longer something that they are offering. It is truly a blessed and amazing experience of all.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. Well, firstly, I'm delighted you're a Presbyterian.
Pardon?
But look, I agree with you. One of the things that we notice in our research is that you'll go to a congregation and you'll explain a lot of things that you're saying and I've talked about, and they'll say, yeah, that's great. If we had anybody here, we would do that. You can work that out for yourself. It will change. It's a bit like Kevin Costner. When you build it, will come. You won't build it. It's the opposite of Kevin Costner. But it's interesting though, because oftentimes, it's more important than people think it is. Because, if you take the ministry of Jesus, people oftentimes think that Jesus sat with the marginalized. Well, he didn't sit with the marginalized. Because what Jesus did was sat with a particular group of people that society decided they particularly want to hang around with. But by sitting with them, he shifted the margins. And so all the religious people were over here doing their thing, and the margins of what God was doing were actually here. So he wasn't on the margin at all, the margin was shifted. And I sometimes wonder that's something to be concerned whether we do precisely that in terms of our churches. Right? Because of doing something else somewhere else, we're here doing a thing which is really good. Except for God's over here. Say, come over here and do your thing. So I think that's a really helpful illustration of this.
And you do really have to work at it because they're not expecting caring communities. They're not expecting accepting communities. They're expecting what they normally experience everywhere else, which is please stay away, please take care of yourself, please be okay, because we don't want to be okay. The church, unfortunately, I can tell you story after story of families that have had that experience. Yes. And it's really unfortunate.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. I have a couple of questions that I think are related, but I'm not sure, and since you gave us permission not to be hypercognitive, I'm not going to worry you too much about following your tracks. But
Yeah, that's a good option.
so I like to think I'm an option. So one is more in the context of parish, and one is more in the context of mental hospital. And I'm really interested in mental illness. I know you have a lot of experience with that, and we haven't talked about that quite as much. But so when you asked us like what stood out, I was thinking about in the intentional communities you were talking about, like what about the guy who got sent home? Like how, and it's not so much a theodicy question as a how can I be a holy person living into my holy values, which recognize everybody else as a holy person and part of the body of the divine, and also recognize people with borderline personality disorder can destroy a congregation if you don't have the right boundaries in place. Right now I work at Harborview, which is a trauma one center here that has 4 psych wards. And we've got people who are like really, who seem very holy, but you know, who built a guillotine and chopped off their arm so they wouldn't steal.
Yeah.
Or who jumped off a 70-foot cliff because God told them to. And so I know there's a way to kind of go where you're talking about going with disability to, like something really holy and also evil happened there. And how do I not just say they're nuts? And how do I help? How do I be with them? What is my role as a chaplain there? You know, like what the hell am I doing? What is my role? Speak to me.
Oh, what do you think of it?
You know, I think I'm just learning. I'm trying to be a compassionate person, but I'm not sure that I'm doing anything for them. I think they're teaching me about mystery.
What would something look like?
What would something look like? I'm very attached to, you know, God is merciful and forgiving, and please don't hurt yourself in the name of God. I'm really attached to that. I don't know how to move beyond, you know, God stopped Abraham. You know, like, if that was a God story, a sheep would have jumped off the cliff at the last minute and you would have been allowed not to jump. Like, God did not tell you to jump and then make you jump. So there's some disconnect there. And you can't say that. They don't get that. You can't just say that and they go, oh, you're right, I never should have done that. They say, no, I was tested in my past. I don't know. I don't think you know the answer. I think I was just hoping you could broaden my question a little for me.
That's a good question first. Well, do you mean? I think it's a good way you push it. Do you mean if somebody abuses themselves in some sense, then I have a fairly everyday anxiety?
Right, I mean, the guy who cut off his arm, I think he's pretty ready to gouge out his eye if he lusts.
Yeah.
I think he would not have any remorse about that.
Yes, but do you mean that should you endorse that behaviour, or do you mean that is that behaviour part of the illness, or do you mean does religion cause that?
I'm pretty sure that religion contributes to causing that, so I guess I don't have that question. I think what I mean is how do you reach somebody like that, or do you just resign yourself to that's part of the illness? I can't solve it.
I would say a little bit of both, because I don't, in relation to mental health issue, particularly psychological issue like that, one of the interesting things about psychosis is, maybe different here in the UK, is that it's quite rare for people to have religious delusions.
Really?
Yes. And the reason it's quite rare to have religious delusions is because your delusion, the content of your delusions tends to reflect your culture and your history. So it doesn't come from nowhere. And so therefore, in our context, people may have the X-Files or some kind of Simpsons, something that's culturally significant.
Right.
And in a context where it's more secularized, which Europe is radically secularized, you do get those delusions, but it tends not to be. In the US, it may be different because you get it. In other words, it might be useful to separate the delusional activity, i.e. something that is pathological, or is, probably is pathological, from the content, because the content may actually remain meaningful even though it's destructive. So it's how you, in a sense, how you separate that which is pathological delusions, hallucinations. Even there, they can serve a positive function. You know, the reason you have a delusion is because it helps you to hold yourself together and give you a sense of self-esteem. So they do something positive as well as something negative. And so as a chaplain, I suppose the key is to work in conjunction with the psychiatric team to begin to tease out that which is caused by the illness. I'm nervous about saying that, and that which is the content, which actually may be useful. Even though it can be destructive, there may still be something very, very useful in that content. And so, in other words, it's not just up to you, I suppose, is what I'm saying. It's up to you to work out a way to negotiate that puts clear tension. So you shouldn't feel bad about it. And you also shouldn't feel responsible because religion has done that, because religion probably hasn't done that in that way.
I think there is a way when you're talking about the developmental disabilities and what's beautiful there. Like, I think the level of their devotion is beautiful, and I think their ability to follow through on these things that are obviously incredibly challenging is actually, in a way, of the divine. So it's this weird tension of horrifying, beautiful, that I think is a lot of what ministering to mental illness.
It's a lot more ministry to anything. Ministry is like human beings are like that. It's just maybe a little bit more concentrated in these contexts.
So I'm here with a few of our children's ministers at our church, and it's kind of been interesting working with the children because then also we're working with the families, and sometimes families almost don't want to burden us with their children. And we don't, and trying to communicate we want them here. We want, even if they're, going to lie on the ground and throw a tantrum, we want them here. And we want to learn how to love them and accept and be in community together. So that's one challenge sometimes, just that it's so sensitive too. And how to do that with the families, because there's I think a lot of fear, a lot of guilt, shame, and then so the message that we give in terms of they don't have to be able to read, they don't have to be able to sit in class, they don't have to what this typical structure of a classroom would look like. They don't have to do that. They can just be here with us, be in the other room. Would it be okay if they're in the other room with their buddy? We have buddies for them, and throw around a ball, and they're happy to come. It just sometimes some families are glad because all they want is they're happy to come to church.
Yes.
And but then some families don't understand that, and we've had his mom not come anymore because she felt like he just couldn't keep up with the class. And that was very sad. But just communicate. It's just hard to do that, communicating with the families and working with them.
Yeah, it is difficult because families oftentimes, you'll see a family at a certain phase and in a certain way. The families are oftentimes beaten up day after day by people, being unpleasant to them, shouting at them, kicking off buses or taxis not stopping, all sorts of things go on. And so oftentimes that's why people are reluctant in exactly the way you're describing, because they don't want to impose, because they've been told from everywhere else that they're imposing, whether that's actually people saying they're imposing or whether just general perception that's given to them. And so the there's this a theologian called Joseph Pieper who has written this little chapter on love. Some people have called faith, hope, and love. And he describes love as as a willful concept whereby you say to the other, it's good that you exist, I'm glad that you are here. Okay, so love is a willful action that says, it's good that you exist, I'm glad that you are here. It seems to me that oftentimes it's the exact opposite that families with disabilities experience. It's not good you're here. It's not good you exist, it's certainly not good that you're here. And so from your ministry's point of view, it's probably embodying that. And you know, it's the idea that it's good that this person's here, because that's what love's about. It's showing people what love looks like rather than just conceptualizing it. Which means that some people won't be able to cope with that. Partly because in the situation you sort of talk about, they may have expectations of their children which can't be met, and which the fact that this child wasn't keeping up is just another example of failure at this time, it's in the context of the church. So some people will fall away, but for you, I think the essence is how you can create that space for love, whereby people can really find and encounter their child in a different way. Yeah. And you're the person, you're the conduit, you're the gateway where they can begin to experience that person in a different way. So even though you can't see it, the ministry that you're pushing towards is really, really important. And people won't verbalize it necessarily saying thank you, I feel much better. But that's your call and that's your task. I think it seems to me that the attitude you have is absolutely bang on.
So, okay, so, sorry, there's another question. So then we have an attitude, the outlook, and then there's the other practical side of choosing curriculum and things like that. And there's these curriculums that are coming out for, I guess, kids. I haven't really taken a look at them, but kids with special needs I don't know. We can't find a curriculum for every single need, and so what's okay. Just we try and provide structure in our Sunday school classes, but at the same time we understand that children are all different,
yes.
all of them,
yes.
with different needs, and we are trying to build a community, not be in school,
Yes.
and learn the love of God, learn scripture, and just kind of, trying to balance all that or hold that all together. Then when I think about special kids with special needs, it all kind of like it just have to toss it out the door. Just go. But I don't want to either, because I want to hold on to that for them and say, they could learn. Something might, come in.
What would success look like? I mean, what would be
for one of these, one of our boys to be able to pray for somebody, and for that person to say, his prayer healed me, the recognition of that, for them to build relationships with the people within the church. I think that would be what would please God.
It's interesting. Because, the essence of love is care. To be able to care for one another is the essence of the way that love works in itself and what love looks like. When Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself, it's to do with care for one another in that sense. But a fundamental aspect of love is receiving care. So a fundamental vocation or part of being human is to receive care and to receive love, not simply to be able to give that back. Because if you think about it, what can you give back to God? Nothing. But God still loves you. You're not any less because you can't give anything back or because you can't do certain things. God just loves you because God loves you. It seems to be a ministry like your own, that's the basic principle. It doesn't really make much difference whether the person's able to do things in that sense, because they still retain their importance simply by being loved. And if your vocation enables you to love them well, then they'll be as close to Jesus as anybody else will be.
We're going to speak out of place here, but 25 years ago, we moved in with Patrick, who is sitting next to us. And Patrick is nonverbal. Patrick knows often what's going on when he's not sleeping. But I think one of the things, because we've lived with Patrick for so long, it was a very commitment that we've kind of raised our children with. This family, we've become unexpectedly, by choice, actually, family members. Patrick isn't my child, Patrick is older than me. But he is part of our family, and I think that because we're his care providers / family, I experience the responsibility of both. And I find in communities that sometimes the way that my perceptions carry into a situation reflects how Patrick is received or how we are received. I go into a situation and I sit in the back of the church because I'm afraid, and our family does, and we continue to do, because I'm afraid that we are going to disrupt the service somehow. Patrick is going to have one of those days, and it's going to be disrupted. And there's several other people in our church that have disabilities in their family who do the same thing, making and accepting us at this point, because we're now family with Patrick, not just his care providers, is almost as important or more important some days than accepting Patrick, because by the family being supported, I can relax and say, oh, we are all accepted and gathered here. There was an experience that we went to a church retreat one time. It's not something that we normally do because it's so difficult to live in gathered family housing with a disabled person that you don't know what he's going to do. And at the end of the retreat, we stood in a circle, church family, and we were holding hands, and each person then turned to the person to their side of them and looked in their eyes and say, the light of God be with you. And then the next person, that person would go. Patrick was holding hands with us. Patrick is nonverbal. I didn't know what we were going to do. Patrick was giggling. Patrick was dancing. Patrick got on feeling really nervous. It came to his turn. I said it to him. He turned over, stopped dancing, stood there, stared into our church chair's eyes. And I said the words, and he looked, and he connected, and she cried. As she spread the light, and the change was very palpable and different, but it was because the community was willing to hold his hand with us together. And I think sometimes we forget that it's a little bit more about the family whole when you're dealing with somebody with disabilities or with somebody with mental illness. It's not about what can I do for that person because I feel sorry for them, I think sometimes, but what support and what love do I give to their whole system? Because that's where their expression comes from. Okay, close up.
So it's a wee thing.
It's a wee thing.
It absolutely is. And that's absolutely the thing we oftentimes forget. And likewise with the whole idea of disruption, whether that means, when you think about Jesus' birth, probably the holiest moment in history. Like there's cows mooing and sheep jumping up and down, and angels, shepherd brother are probably swearing and shouting. And yet, when we talk about the holiness of worship, we always quiet. No, the holiness of worship oftentimes is exactly like that kind of situation you're talking about. I can't sleep at night. And so sometimes I listen to things on my iPod. I was listening to a lecture by a guy called John Goldengate, who's an Old Testament scholar at Fuller. And his wife had severe multiple sclerosis, so towards the end she was really debilitated and really non-communicative. And before he did his lecture, he spoke to his students. He said, "I'd like to come round to our house on Tuesday for pancakes." It's a very good thing about it. He said, "I wanted to go and to speak to my wife at Anson. She's in a wheelchair, so she won't know you, but in that second, she'll appreciate you." And see, I think that's really, really, really important because I'll just finish writing a book on dementia. It's the same thing there. It's learning to respect and understand the sacredness of the present moment, and to be able to capture exactly the kind of moment you're in, and to realise that there's something really, really important happens there. Yeah, the big picture is not the point. Sometimes it's just learning to be in the moment, in the sacrament of the present moment is really, really important.
And so I don't think it's so much about creating curriculum, because I have the same questions, like what do I do? But creating space, creating a place where every person is welcome, which includes that greater family, because then the curriculum happens, because the relationship is there. I think.
I like to think.
You mentioned the idea of professional friendship, and I was wondering if you could kind of speak more to your experience as both a theologian and a nurse. And for those of us who are professionals who work with people experiencing disability, how do we also integrate these concepts as Christians of friendship and spiritual care and find that balance?
The answer is it's very difficult. The large community in Liverpool in the UK just now are wrestling with that very thing, because the way that the large communities have developed is effectively they now have to be regulated in the same way as any other service provider would do so. And the regulators have come to the conclusion that friendship is an inappropriate professional relationship. I see what they mean. So they have to wrestle this, because if they give that up, then they really give up that which is central to who they are. So the answer to your question is probably watch Liverpool and see how that works itself out. But I think friendship is a metaphor for a way of being with other people. In the book that you mentioned earlier on, Resurrecting the Person, the heart of that book is to do with what Christian friendship looks like. And most of the way in which we understand friendship very often in our culture is kind of Aristotelian one, whereby like attracts like. If you look at most of your friends, they probably look a bit like you, because you'll have the same interests, the same ways of dressing, you have lots and lots of things in common. But actually, the principle of the incarnation is that God, who is radically unlike human beings, decides to be friends with them. Like, what do you have in common with God? Apart from that he's a creator. And when you look at the friendships of Jesus, you see the same thing. Jesus, who is kind of unlike these people who are considered to be undesirables, enters into friendship, not because we've got lots and lots of things in common, because they remain tax collectors and sinners. Jesus was friends with tax collectors and sinners, not as friends of people who used to be tax collectors and sinners and still are. And so it's a way of being with somebody that's based on the principle of grace rather than the principle of likeness. And I think it's possible. I mean, it's complicated in the professional context because you're expected to stand back, and the whole issue of boundaries is really, really important, as it should be. But at the same time, you can have an attitude that is graceful, that recognises that this person is much more than a client. This person is a human being with a certain amount of value that's given not by me, but by God, but mediated by me to you through that. So it's possible to use friendship in a metaphorical sense, even if it doesn't mean that you're going down to the pub with pictures with the person who the normal friend would be. But friendship is a way of looking at the world.
So as I was listening to you speak, maybe we need to replace friendship with fellowship, because that's what it's about.
Yes, I think that's right. It's in the UK, if you use the word fellowship, people would think you're a Christian and you'd be able to speak anyway. That's an exaggeration, but there is something really important about fellowship and reclaiming the theological content of what fellowship means as a way of being with one another.
Absolutely, and the power of the word and what we're getting at,
Yes.
the essence of what this relationship is about
Yes, that's exactly right.
with our clients.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you have the same relationship, but you kind of, it's a little bit like reframing, in therapy when a client gets to a problem which is interminable, you shift the focus, you reframe it, and nothing changes, but it looks different. In fellowship's a little bit like that, nothing really changes, but if you look at the person from a different angle, everything changes. I guess that's a good observation.
What are some of your favorite writers in the world of disabilities?
My favourite writer in the world of disabilities? Hans Reiner, I like very much, and his work on friendship in particular, receiving the gift of friendship, which to look at profound intellectual disabilities. I like Amos Young's work, his book Theology and Down Syndrome is very useful, but he's got a new book out called Disability and the Bible. I like Thomas Reynolds' work very much, and Deborah Creamer, her theology of limitation, is that everybody's limited, disabilities one more way of being limited. So these would be some of the main people that I enjoy. There's a lot of very interesting stuff being written just now, so it's a good time to think about it. Did I see somebody's hand over there?
Why do you think at this particular time there is a developing literature on disability and Christian faith?
Do you want me to be honest? Well, obviously.
Yeah.
Because publishers like it. Sell the books. I tell you what's interesting. There's a paper you should read in relation to that. It's by a philosopher called Eve Hacking. And it's a book called, I can't remember, something like autism biographies, autobiographical perspectives on autism. And he's really looking at the way in which autism, our understanding of autism has been transformed by a series of autobiographies and biographies of people with autism, which have shown that the experience of autism is profound profound modes, ways of being living. It's very, very different from the way that the standard kind of theory of mind would put across. But he also notices that there's a publisher in London called Jessica Kingsley Publisher, and they have a huge catalogue on autism. That's the place to go if you want to find a huge diverse perspective on autism. But the question he poses is, which comes first? Is it that our understanding of autism has been shaped by these autobiographies, by this publishing company's decision to publish them, or is it simply that we're becoming more enlightened? And she publishes this catalogue because it makes lots and lots of money, but at the same time it transforms our understanding of what autism is. And so it's a commercial decision on her behalf that actually leads to a deeper understanding, and she might not have made that decision. I think something similar in the realm of disability theology is that these books are selling. And so therefore, publishers take on things that 10 years ago they wouldn't have taken on. So therefore, the profile begins to raise and the shape of disability begins to change in that way. So I wasn't simply being flippant because there's some truth in it. There's some interesting politics and economics in this.
I'm not sure how to really, I haven't thought this question out so specifically, but I'm interested in disabilities, developmental disabilities around the world.
Yes.
How other cultures respond to people with more severe, I suppose, but not necessarily.
Okay. You put your finger on something really, really important, because most of the conversation in relation to disability theology is a Western conversation. And even now it tends to be a conversation between the UK and the US. There's very little research or information coming from the third world, or the emerging world rather. And the reason for that is that people don't have access to publishing. People don't have access to the kind of facilities and ability to the sort of wide audience that we have in the West. This is not available. And one of the things I'd really like to see in the future is begin to look at ways in which we can facilitate the emerging world to participate in this conversation. Because at the moment, all the traffic's one way, and there's nothing coming out, or very little coming out. There's some work by an African theologian called Sam Kiburi, which is the closest that is probably the only comprehensive piece of work that's come from within that area. So it's a problem, not just an issue, it's a problem.
Do you have anecdotal information about how disabled people are received in other parts of the world? Do you know?
Well, I have anecdotal information. I wouldn't want to be the bearer of anecdotal information. Suffice to say, it can be very difficult, I think, for people with certain forms of disabilities on Pastoral. And yeah, I don't want to speculate. But it's a conversation that needs to take place. So if anybody is looking for a research project or a way of facilitating some forgotten and hidden voices, that's one good reason for that.
I completely understand what you're talking about, how you are who you are because of the people around you. And that really connects with me because I provide respite care for a teenage girl with special needs. And she started asking me to take her to church, so I did. But you definitely get a lot of strange looks and stuff from people because they go to church that's largely filled with college students and they're probably not as exposed to people with, especially teenagers with special needs. And they don't really, I was just wondering if you have any advice on how to get that concept of like we across to them and how that accepting of her coming to church would make it more of a growing experience for everyone.
You taking her as the first step.
Yes, that's right. Well, friendship testimony, isn't it? I think the testimony and witness. I mean, what happens when you go to court is you witness, as a witness, you testify that what you've seen is true and right and proper, and you do that before other people. And I think your point is absolutely right, that your presence with her is testimony to her value. As to how you change teenagers' minds on difference. I've got a house full of them. The same way as person about disability champions, you're the key really in terms of testifying on her behalf that she's worthwhile being with. And if other people don't take that on board, they'll persevere.
Can you clarify, I know you've been using the word friendship a lot, and you had talked about large, and I know only a little about the community. So you had said that a major aspect is that instead of having caregiver or provider and recipient, that they're friends. Does that mean that, is that just in the friend, in the way that you were saying, the way that we consider somebody and yet, so to not be the caregiver, or are they still the caregiver but they're taking on the friend, or do they have other people who are the caregivers so that this person's associated, like, no, they're your friend?
It's just a different way of thinking. So for example, a person with a developmental disability doesn't just get allocated to a large community. The people within that community need to invite them and welcome them in. Likewise, you don't just get employed in a large community, you have to be welcomed into that community. In other words, it's a decision of the people within it to bring you in. And so they just don't use or function or understand the language of care and caregiver. Even if you look in, you might say, well, they're doing something similar. But actually they're not, because the ethos of the community is that, yes, I'm helping you, but you're helping me. Yeah. So at the heart of the kind of ritual and symbol of L'Arche is foot washing. So regularly they take the sacrament. They also wash one another's feet or wash one another's hands, depending on whether they think it's appropriate. The point being that they minister to one another, and this is symbolic of of the ministry. So if I have to bath you or to change you, that's just because I'm helping you, because you help me in other ways. It's not because I'm a caregiver, it's just because we recognise one another's needs.
One more thing in some of this response, I do a lot of retreats and trainings and share with families. And I find that families, by the time they get to the spiritual process, are pretty worn out with the school process, with the social process, with all the different dynamics. There's housing, there's just tons of things. And my hope and my prayer would be that they would have energy enough to do it in the church too. Because everybody has a right to spiritual connection. Everybody has a right to spiritual growth. It's not just those of us who are able to articulate and express it. But I don't think that's likely. I think we're going to have to initiate it. We're going to have to go with them. We're going to have to encourage them and be able to share with them how important it is that they are here. And it's not going to come because they're advocates for them and everywhere else, but they're just too worn out to do this too. And they expect different. I think they deserve it.
Yeah. Good. So are there any places stuff?
Thank you all very much for being a part of this forum tonight. Many of you walked in after we had introduced the sponsoring initiative, which is our initiative for intellectual and developmental disabilities in our school, and we have a sheet for names and emails over there my colleague Jeff Wilson has. If you'd like to be on our email list for upcoming programs, we would be delighted to send you that information. There may be so many of you, however, that I'm thinking what I'll do is give you my email. I'll put it on the board. You send me your name and email, I'll transfer it over to Deb, and that'll make things a lot simpler as we say good evening. All right? I'll put it up on the board. A good evening to you all. Please come back on Thursday night, by the way, for our Palmer lecture. Who is this gentleman? We may be in a tie for that one. I'm not sure what your plans are. No. But, yeah, in fact, Doug, you want to speak to that very quickly?
Sure. So the Palmer Lectureship is at First Free Methodist Church, which is just on 3rd Avenue across from the campus, and it will be at 7:30. So we welcome everyone, please. We enjoy having you there.
How is it different from this?
Let's ask our speaker what he's going to be speaking on.
I can't tell you the punchline. Suffice to say, it'll be different. It's different.
I just want to mention that we are videotaping, and I understand Mr. Swinton's given us permission to put this on our website so that you could see the lecture later. Am I correct about that?
How about if we sell it, you get 50% of the take?
There you go.
I would say 6 times ago.
We'll work that out. Clarify again. A good evening to you all.